Welcome and good evening. And on that note, belated happy President's Day as well. My name is Jacob Begard, and I serve as Program Manager of the Common Ground Initiative in the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center, Gleaves Whitney and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and Brooke Clement and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, thank you for joining us tonight, whether that's in person or on Zoom. We'll begin, as always, with a leadership minute from a student in our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Then, Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and our good friend Gleaves Whitney will introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. After Lindsay's remarks, Gleaves will join her for a short discussion before moving to a live audience Q&A. Following the evening presentation, Lindsay will be signing copies of her book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution in the Exhibition Hall. The connection between leadership and the study of history is well documented. History allows us to understand the past and place it within its proper context, while also enabling us to make more informed decisions about our future. Now, I'd like to turn it over to a student who practices the importance of informed leadership. Lydia Cooper is in her third year in the Leadership Academy and one of this year's lead fellows. Upon graduation next year, Lydia plans to put her passion for nursing into action. Please help me welcome to the stage, Lydia.
My name is Lydia Cooper, and I am a third-year Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate. When I think of leadership, there is one characteristic that comes to mind in particular. This word is likely familiar to you in some capacity, as it has become a major way that we have described frontline healthcare workers throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. This word, resilient. In the words of healthcare advocate Elizabeth Edwards, resilience is accepting your new reality, even if it's less good than the one you had before. You can fight it, you can do nothing but scream about what you've lost, or you can accept that and try to put together something that is good. As a nursing student and as a patient care technician at a local Grand Rapids area hospital, I've seen firsthand just how resilient our healthcare workers are. Against all odds, physicians, nurses, and so many others behind the scenes continue to show up and provide hope. While living in this pandemic is not the reality any of us would have chosen, we do have a choice to make. In circumstances in life where adversity rears its head from every corner, we as leaders can choose to persevere. Not all of us will be asked to fight a pandemic in our hospital systems. But even as policymakers, educators, consultants, and every career path represented in this room, we will be asked to be resilient, to show up, to advocate for others, and to make an otherwise awful situation into something good and beautiful. Continuing to show up in this manner is resilience, and something I will argue that all leaders need to embrace in a fuller capacity today. Psychologist Karen Rivich says it best. Resilience is not all or nothing. It comes in amounts. You can be a little resilient, a lot resilient. Resilient in some situations, but not others. And no matter how resilient you are today, you can become more resilient tomorrow. My name is Lydia Cooper, and I am a leader.
Much for that talk on your relationship to the virtues. And one of the preeminent virtues of all, of course, is resilience. So that's a very important one to have. And we're going to be hearing a lot about an individual who had resilience as George Washington. So I think your theme ties in beautifully. Thank you, and good luck to you. Well, good evening. Are you hungry to learn? Yes, you're hungry to learn, and this is the right place to be this evening because your mind is in store for a feast. As I was introduced, Gleaves Whitney, I was here for 17 years as the director of the Hauenstein Centers for Presidential Study, and now I'm over at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. And I'm proud that we're joined by our partners, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, with its director, Brooke Clement, to host this evening's event. Now, if you cross, say, a Broadway musical like Hamilton, that I think everybody in here is familiar with a New York Times bestseller like Team of Rivals, I think you get something like Lindsay Chervinsky's book on George Washington and the creation of an American institution, The Cabinet. It's a wonderful book. It combines sort of that magnetic attraction by its story of Len Manuel with the historical sleuthing of Doris Kearns Goodwin. This first book of Dr. Chervinsky's received one of the greatest accolades possible when it was accepted for publication by Harvard University Press, just to be accepted. And then when it was published in 2020, of course, it got sort of the good housekeeping seal of approval in American letters, I would say. But note that date, 2020. The book comes out about 3 weeks into the pandemic. So our speaker this evening had the dubious distinction of being one of the first authors who had to give her book tour through Zoom. Can you imagine the torture? Dr. Chervinsky is a historian of early America and the presidency and the cabinet. She comes to us from Northern Virginia, where she assures me that the weather this winter has not been that much better than ours in Michigan, and so that's why we're passing the sympathy card around for her. Just sign it as it comes across, and we'll send it to her when she gets back. Dr. Chervinsky teaches it fittingly, where else? George Washington University, and she's a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at SMU down in Dallas, Texas. And prior to her current post, she was a presidential historian with the White House Historical Association, which we work with a lot of great people there. And her distinguished early career was teed up when she earned her PhD in history at the University of California, Davis, I believe in 2017. That would have made her very old, 2017. And now about the book she will be discussing with her this evening. I always read book reviews. What do the reviewers, the professionals, say about a book when it comes out? And I was taken by this one. One of her peers wrote, quote, "Lindsay Travinsky offers a new perspective on a crucial and enduring institution, persuasively showing the centrality of the cabinet in the founding era and beyond. With a compelling story, this book is a must-read for anyone interested in learning about the foundation of the American Republic." Well, this is high praise and well-deserved. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Lindsay Chervinsky.
Very kind introduction, and indeed it is such a pleasure to see faces in person after 2 years of little tiny boxes on a screen. If I'm lucky, sometimes it was just one black box. So this is a real joy to be here. This is my first time at the center. It has been such a pleasure, and I'm so impressed by the programming and all that you do, so I hope it will be the first of many visits. President's Day is kind of a little bit of a weird holiday, right? It's, we have presidents that have been extraordinary. We have some presidents that have been mediocre. We've had some presidents that have been pretty terrible. And yet we all kind of clump them into this one group. But I would argue, and my goal today is to show why maybe the day does really matter, what we need to learn from it, what we can celebrate from it, and what it reminds us about American society and our institutions and the importance they play in our daily life. So any discussion of President's Day actually has to start with, of course, our first president, George Washington. His birthday was celebrated from basically the moment the Revolutionary War began, because the colonists had been very used to celebrating the birth of the king, and they needed someone to celebrate and something to do, and so they basically put in Washington, and they celebrated his birthday. And these experiences continued up through his presidency, which made sense. He was the first president. We may as well celebrate his contributions, and they were many and laudatory. After he died, they took on an even more extraordinary note, and he was celebrated as almost a godlike figure. One particular example was the oration that was commissioned by Congress just a few days after his death in December of 1799. They asked Henry Lee, who had been one of his officers, friends, and a fellow Virginian, to write about Washington's life and all of the nuance and complexity that he offered. Well, Lee kind of glossed over that nuance and complexity part and wrote an oration that does talk about the extraordinary things Washington did, but even some of the language today when we read it is a little bit shocking, because Washington, as extraordinary as he was, did indeed have flaws. Perhaps the most famous line in this oration was when Lee proclaimed that Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. I'm sure it's a phrase you have all heard before. What I love about this story is that Lee actually wrote this eulogy when he was sitting in the home that used to be Benjamin Franklin's house in Philadelphia. So he was sitting in the home of one of the great Americans, writing about another great American, to try and encourage future Americans to remember their contributions. After Washington died, people continued to celebrate his birthday in sort of a haphazard fashion. So if you belonged to a local community that had celebrations like balls or parades, maybe you would attend those. Gadsby's Tavern on the right held a regular birth night ball, which Washington did attend while he was alive, and they continued after his death. Some families had private ceremonies to honor the first president. My favorite is in Laredo, Texas. They staged a 2-day pitched battle every year to commemorate Washington, which is a little bit interesting because, of course, Washington had never been to Texas, but I like the flair that they bring to that particular celebration. This process became much more official in 1879 when Congress passed a bill creating Washington's birthday as a federal holiday. It was the first federal holiday that honored a single individual, and of course I think fitting that it was Washington, but the timing and the context was particularly important. In 1879, Reconstruction had essentially failed. The United States was trying to figure out how to piece itself back together after the very bloody and difficult Civil War. Civil rights had sort of crumbled in the South, and people were really questioning what was the purpose of all of this fighting. Well, Washington was a history that everyone could agree upon. Washington was safe. Washington was a Virginian who had adopted the North as his home, was someone that had fought for independence in the Revolution, and was something and somebody and a cause that all sides could use as a touchstone as a safe subject. So it makes sense that in that moment, in that very fraught context, a holiday celebrating his birth would come about. Now, despite the fact that there was an official Washington's birthday holiday, all of the states kind of came up with their own naming practices, including Washington's Day, Washington and Lincoln's Day. My favorite is Alabama, which is Washington and Jefferson Day, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because Jefferson's birthday is in April, and he never lived in Alabama. But nonetheless, each state still actually has their own tradition. And February 2nd fell on a bunch of different days, of course, as the calendar moved along, which was confusing for people who were maybe trying to plan days off from work or trying to figure out their work schedule. So in 1968, Congress passed the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, which made a bunch of holidays come on Mondays, obviously, including Martin Luther King Day, what was Columbus Day, now in some states is Indigenous Peoples Day, and of course, Washington's official birthday celebration. It was halfway in between Lincoln and Washington's birthday, which made sense because at this point, Lincoln had risen to the pantheon of presidential greats and would, from this point forward, even though it was known as Washington's birthday, fall on the third Monday of every month. Well, President Nixon felt a little bit left out, and he decided to issue a proclamation renaming it President's Day. He even said in his speech that he wanted to be included, so I'm not attributing something to him that he did not actually feel. And so we officially have President's Day. But again, that kind of brings up this strange awkwardness. It's kind of weird to celebrate Washington and Lincoln with maybe some forgettable characters like Chester Arthur or William Henry Harrison, and some outright kind of bad presidents like Buchanan and Andrew Johnson. From the very beginning, John Adams commented that this was a really strange thing to do. In fact, during his presidency, citizens continued to host celebrations in honor of Washington's birthday, and they invited him, which he thought was incredibly insulting and was really annoyed about and refused to go, which caused a little bit of a kerfluffle, which is the typical Adams form. But John Adams and Abigail Adams wrote back and forth about how it was inappropriate in a republic to celebrate one person. We were not a monarchy. We were not supposed to celebrate God-given right to any one person. So why were they celebrating Washington as though he wasn't human? This, I think, is a bit of a conundrum that we still struggle with today, is how much are we supposed to celebrate individuals when we know that they're flawed just like the rest of us? Well, I would argue that President's Day, and perhaps we should call it Presidency Day, is a really important moment to take stock of what the president means to us as Americans. It represents us on the global stage. It has the ability to shape our culture and our values. It wields enormous authority, both over domestic affairs and foreign policy. and is something that we really can't get away from on a day-to-day basis. The presidency also is wrapped up in our very best and our very worst moments. So just a couple of examples of the extraordinary things that presidents can accomplish. There's, of course, the victory in Civil War. I love this picture of Abraham Lincoln because his top hat makes him so very, very tall. Theodore Roosevelt and the quest to preserve our natural resources, our national parks, and the treasures that we have in our nation. Kennedy and the race for the moon, our space program is such an extraordinary accomplishment. FDR and the struggle to preserve democracy and defeat fascism in Europe. And Eisenhower, I would argue the moment that he decides to use military force to enforce the Brown versus Board education demonstrates how the presidency can be used for good. Well, all of these things, our preservation of American institutions that we hold and the traditions that we hold so dear, the culture that the president is responsible for creating, and the values that the president can espouse, and of course, the authority that the president uses on a day-to-day basis, all started with Washington. Washington really set the tone when he returned his commission. After the end of the Revolutionary War, he handed back power. He believed in the importance of civilian authority, and he believed in returning power when it was no longer needed. Now, we know this today, and we have transitions of power today, so it doesn't seem quite as extraordinary in this moment as it did back then. But Americans were students of history, and they had read about Oliver Cromwell, who had turned into a military dictator. And just a couple years later, they saw the same thing happen with Napoleon. So they had good reason to be shocked when Washington returned his commission. That sort of reluctance to seize authority, the restraint that he demonstrated, his willingness to know when not to say something. He received criticism all the time and almost never took the bait. These were key elements of the virtues that Washington thought were essential to Republican, and this is little r, Republican leadership. One of Washington's challenges as the first president was figuring out what a president is supposed to look like. How is a president supposed to act? How are they supposed to interact with people or host people? Where are they supposed to sit? How are they supposed to be introduced? These might seem like silly details until you have to make all of these decisions for the first time, and then all of a sudden you realize just how much pressure is on every single decision. I'm sure all of you at some point or another have read the Constitution, and Article 2, I'm sure you've noticed, is very, very short. There aren't very many words there. There are a couple of good reasons for this. One, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were sitting in the room with Washington when they were trying to figure out how to craft this institution, and it must have been pretty awkward to talk about limitations or potential misuse of power when the first president, or the likely first president, was sitting there staring at you. Must have been a little bit tense. By the end of the summer, they were really tired. It was hot. They wanted to go home. They just wanted to be done with it. So maybe they kind of just decided to leave it for the first president to fill out some of those fuzzy details and figure out how to comport himself. And finally, they were brilliant men, and they were smart enough to know that they didn't necessarily know what was coming down the pike. And they needed to leave things a little bit vague, a little bit of wiggle room for the first president to use that flexibility and creatively come up with structures and methods to grapple with the very real challenges that were going to face that person at the highest office. So Washington had to, again, come up with all of these things. And one of the really important elements of that was how to be accessible to the American people. This was not a king. This is not someone who was going to be locked behind a fence. So he and Martha hosted a series of social events every single week. He hosted levees on Tuesday for men. Martha hosted drawing rooms on Friday afternoons. And the point of these was, of course, to provide space for the sort of discussion and negotiation that's so important in politics when you kind of need to do some things behind the scenes outside of the halls of Congress, but also for regular people to be able to see and talk to the president. This picture shows The drawing rooms didn't actually look like this, but this depicts the drawing rooms. It's a much fancier version. Washington also hosted weekly state dinners on Thursday afternoons. He invited Supreme Court justices, secretaries from the departments, congressmen, visiting dignitaries, people from abroad, elite families. He brought them together and was very attentive to make sure that no one state was more represented than others in the dinners. And these social events demonstrate something that we still expect presidents to do today. When a president hosts a state dinner, that's really important legitimacy for the other leader that the president is hosting. That matters a great deal in foreign policy. When a president hosts a 4th of July celebration and has veterans or the children of people serving abroad, that's a really important social element that we expect the president to participate in. When Washington took office in 1789, there was not really nationalism in any real way. The flag didn't have the same sort of symbolic importance that it does today, and people had very few emotional ties to the federal government. So Washington set about trying to create some sort of emotional bonds to bring the government to the people. And what better was a national symbol of the federal government than Washington himself? So he conducted a series of tours. He went to every single state, started with the northern route. He skipped Rhode Island because they had not yet ratified the Constitution, and he could be very petty when he wanted to be. Once they did ratify, he went back and visited, so it was a sort of stick and carrot situation. He then went and did a southern tour, and this southern tour was a very symbolic choice. The travel was incredibly uncomfortable. The roads were terrible. They were dusty, there was no pavement. He insisted upon staying in public housing because he didn't want to impose on any private citizen. They were filled with lice and vermin. You often had to share a bed. The food was gross. So this was not a fun travel experience. But Washington was insistent that the people be able to see him, that he bring the federal government to them, and they recognized that sacrifice. Washington also was tasked with trying to find the right balance between prestige and cultivating respect, especially from foreign dignitaries, people who had been to places like the Court of St. James and Versailles, and were used to a certain level of, frankly, flashiness when we're thinking about government, but also cultivating a certain amount of Republican virtue. And again, this is little r Republican virtue. So how do you find that balance between fancy and sort of your average man? This is still something that we negotiate as a society. Do we want an average peanut farmer? Do we want a very wealthy businessman as our president? This is something that we still have not yet come to a good answer about. So Washington came up with a series of compromises. First, he was going to have the most exquisite coach in all of North America. It would have looked like this, although it would have been cream-colored with gold trim. Does anyone here have a white car? Yes, so you know that when it rains or when the weather is bad, your car gets disgusting. And that is with proper sewage and asphalt and running water. Imagine having a cream-colored coach with no sewage, no asphalt, and no running water. It was an incredible demonstration of wealth that you could hire or own enough labor to clean the coach by hand every time you took it out onto the street. So this was quite a statement and very recognizable by anyone who saw it. On the other hand, he took a daily walk, first in New York City and then in Philadelphia when the seat of government moved there. And he didn't take a walk because he wanted exercise. He preferred to ride. But this walk demonstrated that he was just like any other citizen. His boots got muddy or covered with whatever happened to be on the street, too. And that symbolic choice was one his contemporaries very much understood. We might not see the symbolic value in that, but they definitely got it. Similarly, when dressing for his inauguration, he ordered a homespun suit. Now, it was a very nice homespun, a very expensive homespun, but it wasn't French silk or British wool. It was American homespun. So he was the first president to wear Made in America. However, he also liked some finery, so he had diamond shoe buckles. So again, a little bit of this balance between sort of the average man and fancy. So in addition to the social elements of what it meant to be a president, to present oneself, to host, to cultivate the right air of respectability and accessibility, Washington also had to govern, which was, no small feat. Article 2 says that the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, will make treaties and foreign appointments. In 1789, that was very much understood to mean that the Senate would consult on foreign policy. They were supposed to be an advisory body on all matters, treaties, foreign appointments, diplomacy, foreign policy. And Washington fully had that expectation. He had been at every single session of the Constitutional Convention and arranged for a meeting at the Senate just a couple of months into his presidency to talk about an upcoming peace summit. It went terribly. The Senate refused to give immediate advice and discuss the issue. They avoided eye contact and wanted to, refer it to committee and ask him to come back later. It was very frustrating for Washington, and although he did agree to come back the following week, he reportedly said on his way out that he would never again return for advice. And he never again returned for advice. And since then, no president has ever returned to the Senate for advice. So just a couple of months into Washington's presidency, one of these key elements of governing that was anticipated by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had proven to be too inefficient, or the senators were frankly too annoying to actually work productively. Washington also established incredibly important precedents over domestic and foreign policy. In 1793, France declared war on Great Britain, and the war quickly spiraled into an international conflict, and Washington and the cabinet worked closely to keep the United States out of the war. They spent several months coming up with a list of rules of neutrality that would keep citizens sort of in line and would keep foreign actors from causing too much trouble. They submitted those rules to Congress, and Congress codified them into law, which governed periods of neutrality up until the Civil War. Congress didn't have to do that. This was foreign policy, after all. The Senate could have insisted it had a role in deciding whether or not the United States was going to be neutral, in deciding how that would work. Instead, by ceding that authority, Washington basically created this precedent that the president was going to be in charge of foreign policy going forward, almost unilaterally. And that holds true today. The very next year, a rebellion broke out in western Pennsylvania over an excise tax. And again, Washington was posed with how to manage this unprecedented situation. He could leave it to the states, he could work with Congress to figure out a solution, or he could use a recently passed law that allowed the president to call up state militias in order to deal with a foreign invasion or a domestic rebellion. He chose that option. As you probably know, the state militias marched out, crushed the rebellion, it established the principle of federal taxation, and Congress didn't really say anything. Congress let it happen. By ceding that authority, by sort of agreeing with Washington's actions and agreeing that Washington had taken the correct step, Congress ceded authority to the president over domestic policy. And to this day, when we're faced with a big moment or a crisis or a pandemic, we expect the president to be the leading voice and to take action. Finally, Washington was the first president to assert executive privilege. In 1796, the House had requested a series of documents pertaining to Jay's Treaty, and Washington said no. He didn't use this terminology, but essentially he said for national security reasons, these papers had to stay quiet. During the question and answer portion, I'd love to talk more about that document because it is fascinating and shows Washington's political savviness, his acuity, but also his sassiness, which often goes overlooked. But for now, we should just know that Washington was the first president to assert executive privilege, and it goes all the way back to him. Of course, one cannot get through a talk about the presidency in Washington without talking about the cabinet. I think that the cabinet is Washington's most important and underappreciated legacy. Cabinets are the best way to study any sort of presidency because they get at the leadership qualities that are so important. They help us understand whether or not the president can manage men. They help us understand the key elements of the presidency, and Washington was no different. His cabinet was essential to every major moment, almost every major incident, whether it be domestic or foreign policy. And he pulled together a group of men that would provide diverse, they are all white guys, but at the time they were considered very diverse because they came from different backgrounds and educations and represented different interests. He intentionally sought out those diverse perspectives, asked for their help, and came up with solutions based on that input. Now, the institution he created was actually quite flexible. Towards the end of his presidency, when this initial team retired or resigned, he replaced it with people who I affectionately refer to as the B team. Washington didn't like them very much. It was really hard to get people to fill office. You weren't paid very much, the responsibilities were overwhelming, travel was terrible, you were away from your families, and I think that Washington just didn't really want to talk to them. So he convened very few meetings towards the end of his presidency, establishing a precedent that the cabinet is designed to help the president however he sees, hopefully someday she sees fit. The president can meet regularly, can meet several times a week like Abraham Lincoln, or weekly like Theodore Roosevelt, or the president can decide that he kind of wants to pit the secretaries against each other like FDR did with so much success. The president can decide that he really prefers advisors and people outside of the administration, like friends, colleagues, business associates, like Kennedy often did. And all of those relationships take place with very little public and congressional oversight. Now, sometimes, as I mentioned, presidents do great with that flexibility. Lincoln is a fantastic example. I would say Eisenhower is a fantastic example. Sometimes presidents do terribly with that flexibility. Madison was completely overrun by his cabinet. Harding was really undermined by his. But that potential, or the peril, of a cabinet goes back to Washington's creation. Now, finally, in 1796, Washington was determined to retire. He had really wanted to retire 4 years earlier, and a bunch of his friends and colleagues convinced him that the country needed him for 4 more years. This time, there was absolutely no convincing him. He was tired. He wanted to go home. Most of the men in the Washington family died pretty young, so he was convinced he was going to die like any day and was quite morbid about it, talked about it frequently. He knew his reputation could only go down from where it was. And finally, he believed in the importance of a planned transition. If he died in office, it would be chaotic, it would be scary, it would be very emotional, and it would potentially be very unsettling for the future of the nation. So in September of 1796, he published his farewell address and announced his intention to go home. There was an election, John Adams was duly elected, and Washington was very intentional about making sure that happened while he was present. Americans had to figure out, had to learn, had to cultivate the practice of transition and foster that process in the American system. It was not learned. Most of the transitions that they had observed in Europe were caused by death, war, rebellion, and indeed the most recent transition they had seen was the French Revolution, which was primarily characterized by guillotines. So not a great model for the American version to follow. This was all a very conscious choice by Washington, and one that was shared and equally committed to by John Adams and then Thomas Jefferson. I think until recently, most Americans took elections and peaceful transitions of power for granted. They did not. They knew that this process had to be learned, cherished, and embedded with precedent and custom. The first transition of power took place on March 4th, 1797, in the building up top on the right. It's Congress Hall in Philadelphia. The room on the first floor is pictured here on the bottom, and that's the House of Representative Chambers. John Adams took the oath of office, became the second president, and Washington was present. Now, his presence was unexpected. There was no practice at the state level of the previous person showing up to an inauguration. But his presence gave a certain element of legitimacy and endorsed Adams as his successor, silently, because he didn't say much, but silently endorsed Adams. Adams greatly appreciated it and learned from that experience And 4 years later, after it was clear that he had lost the election, but the outcome was still uncertain, he was offered the opportunity to meddle in the House of Representatives, and he said no. Instead, he invited Thomas Jefferson over to the White House, which must have been incredibly awkward because they had spent the last 6 months printing terrible lies about one another and weren't really speaking and had been really good friends. So this was a very bad relationship at this point. And they both committed to a peaceful transfer of power and to recognizing the sanctity of that election. These are things that, again, have to be learned. They have to be cherished. They have to be carefully cultivated. Washington started that process, and his immediate successors were determined to see it through. That's, I think, what we should remember on President's Day. That's the stuff that's worth celebrating. Thank you so much for being here today. It was a real pleasure to share this information with you. I'm so excited to have a further conversation and to take your questions. I actually like the question and answer portion best because I want to know what you want to know about and to give that information. So I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chervinsky.
Thank you.
That was really insightful, and I learned a lot from you. And in our earlier conversations today, we've talked about a number of things, and I guess I always want to start in a Socratic spirit.
Okay.
And Socrates always insisted on the right definition of things. Where's the word cabinet come from? What's special about cabinet?
Well, I'm so glad we're starting with this question because the history is really a demonstration of the uniqueness of the English language. So in the 16th century, the Privy Council emerged in Great Britain as an important governing body to assist the king with matters of state. Starting in the 17th century, that body began to grow in size, and anyone who's been in a meeting with too many people knows how hard it can be to get everyone to get on the same page. So the king started pulling off his favorite advisors into a small room off the Privy Council chambers known as the King's Cabinet. It was quite literally a closet. Cabinet was another word for closet at the time. And they would meet in this closet to have their very secret advice. This group became known as the King's Cabinet Council, and eventually council was dropped and it became known as the King's Cabinet. Now the membership sort of was in flux and there were definitely no meeting minutes taken because this was supposed to be private and secretive. And that secretive nature was really sort of embedded in the description cabinet. So when Washington started to meet with people privately, secretly, no official notes were taken. There were lots of notes, thank goodness. As a historian, that's how I'm able to tell the story, but no official meeting notes were taken. The word cabinet was applied, and it was used with some regularity by 1792. It was very much in the political discourse.
Fascinating. So much has been written about the founding, and to mine all the archives, and that would be an interesting question, where are your favorite archives to mine, but when you mine all the archives, you look at all the great writers we've had in the previous generation and current generation who are writing about the founding. What attracted you to write about George Washington's cabinet?
So I guess that's a two-part question. The first is the word cabinet isn't in the Constitution. And so I set about trying to kind of figure out where it came from, thinking, surely someone has written this book. The institution has been around since the 1790s. It's not exactly hiding. It's in the news all the time. Surely someone has discussed it. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked, and I went to my advisor at the time and I said, I'm not finding anything. And I think maybe he thought I was trying to avoid doing the homework. And he's like, okay, well, go look in these places. And I came back and I said, I really don't see anything on this. So then he went and he looked because he didn't believe me. And sure enough, the last book that was published on the origins of the cabinet, people have written about specific cabinets or especially 20th century presidents, but the last book that was written on the origins was in 1912, and it was out of print. And I think everyone just assumed, because this is such a prominent institution, that someone else had written this story. But once I realized that there was this huge opening, I then spent the next 8 years hoping no one would beat me to it. And thankfully, they didn't.
Oh, that's delightful. So cabinets are very useful, but cabinets are also prone to scandal every once in a while. Could you tell us a little bit about George Washington's cabinet's first scandal?
Yes. So This is truly a 18th century scandal because we don't have perfect answers about what happened. In 1794, in the middle of the Whiskey Rebellion, Edmund Randolph, who had been the first Attorney General and was now the Secretary of State, was conversing with the French minister and I think said something like, if you were to invest in the rebels, you could change the course of history. Not suggesting that they should, but saying that basically, history was kind of on a knife's edge. The French minister wrote a report about that conversation and sent it back to the government in France, except the ship that the letter was traveling on was captured by a British ship. The British captain gave the letter to the British minister, who gave the letter, this is so 18th century, gave the letter to some of the other cabinet members who didn't particularly like Randolph because he had Washington's ear. He was the most powerful, and they resented that. They didn't speak French very well, and they translated this letter to mean that Randolph said to Washington, Randolph said to the French minister, for a certain amount of money, I will give you like state secrets. I will change the course of the outcome. So basically it was sort of like literally a lost in translation moment. Here's the problem. Washington didn't speak French. He didn't read French. So he had to rely on that translation from the other secretaries. And he confronted Randolph about it, who had been one of his closest friends for almost 3 decades. And Randolph was so insulted that he quit in a huff because his personal honor was insulted. And then later realized, hey, maybe I should actually do something to defend my reputation, and requested the documents from his department to sort of prove that he was innocent. But by then it was kind of too late and rumor had begun to circulate. Washington did send him the letters, but some of them got lost in the mail, and Randolph ended up publishing all of their correspondence in the newspaper, which was the one thing Washington never forgave. And so they never spoke again.
That wasn't the first time that Washington had been caught up short by not understanding French. It also happened back in the 1750s
Yes.
after Jumonville Glen and then the Great Meadow where the fort is overrun.
Yes.
And he is tricked, as it were, into surrendering everything. And it's a national park in southwest Pennsylvania. If you ever get the chance to go to Jumonville Glen and the Great Meadow, you can learn about this. But you would have thought that he would have learned there to be careful. It was a Dutchman who was actually doing the translating from French to English.
The problem with that, I mean, yes, absolutely. And if the language of diplomacy is French in the 18th century, it's helpful to know the language most people are speaking in. The problem with that explanation, and Washington was a very savvy political figure, is that the word assassinate in French is really similar to the word assassinate in English. And so even if you don't speak French, it's pretty easy to understand what that letter said. And he probably didn't have that excuse, but it served his purpose as well.
He was very cagey, wasn't he?
He was.
Okay, well that leads actually to the next topic that I'd like to ask you about. You know, we have students who are watching. This will be on the shelf, your talk and our conversation, potentially for many years. And for students who are looking for leadership lessons, it's always important to see the other thing that Washington established that was so important, and that was his character was important to the operation of this government, to being the head of state, and for winning wars or outlasting enemies by attrition. There are all kinds of ways Washington's character or his virtue were important. So I wanted to ask you, the founders were very familiar with the word virtue and with the Aristotelian notions of virtue. So let's just walk through a couple of different, 3-4 different aspects of virtue. Give us an illustration of how Washington's virtue asserted itself for the good of our country. So let's take, Aristotle starts with intellectual virtue, the ability to think. Now Washington, as we all know, was very ashamed in a sense that he didn't have a good formal education like at King's College or something like that. How did he compensate for not having that great formal education?
Well, I love that you use the word compensate, because some people, if they felt worried about their lack of education, would use bluster or try and pretend like that was not the case, or, compensate in a way that, like have giant I'm going to probably insult someone here, but have giant tires on your car. Sometimes that's like, a little bit too showy. Sorry if that's insulting to someone. Washington did the opposite, and he was determined to constantly improve himself. He was determined to constantly improve his self-education. One of my favorite stories, at the very end of the Constitutional Convention, he was having dinner with Benjamin Franklin and the Spanish minister, and they were talking about Don Quixote, and he hadn't read it. And so the very next day, he said that he hadn't read it. The very next day, he went and he bought a copy, and it was shipped to Mount Vernon. And a couple of months later, he gets a package in the mail, and it is from the Spanish minister, and he said, I found the most beautifully detailed and pictured copy I could find. I'm sorry it's in Spanish. I know you don't read Spanish, but it's the most beautiful copy I could find of Don Quixote, and I wanted you to have it. Both of those copies are actually still in his library at Mount Vernon, but I think it demonstrates a willingness and a commitment to constantly improve himself. So that's one side of it. The other side of it was that he sought out people who knew more than he did. He sought out people who were more experienced or had different experiences and could help him make a better choice. And he asked for their advice regularly. He went to first councils of war and then cabinet meetings without having his mind made up. He wanted to hear all of the input first, and then he made a decision based on all of the evidence. And that takes remarkable strength to say, I don't know this. Can you please help me? Not many people can do that, but the best presidents are the ones that do that.
So he was secure.
He was. He was wildly insecure about certain things, but also wildly secure about other things. He was an enigma.
Right. Very complex character. So virtue-anchored leadership also, I think, to most minds, goes to character, to the moral character, fiber of an individual. What would you say about Washington's moral fiber and his North Compass?
Well, this one's a little bit tricky because obviously some of the choices he made in his life feel very uncomfortable from 21st century standards. I think that Washington's greatest moral strength was his intention to always question whether or not he was doing the right thing, to try and seek out what the right thing was. Now, that doesn't mean he always got it right, or that doesn't mean we are always comfortable with his choices. It's hard in any sense of the word to justify the horrors and brutality of slavery. I do think he showed a willingness to grow and to learn from his experiences. His opinion on race and slavery did evolve over time based on what he saw during the war. He saw that Black soldiers fought with valor and courage and commitment, and that was impressive to him and changed his ideas about whether or not Black Americans could participate in citizenship. Now, on the flip side of that, he pursued self-emancipated enslaved individuals until the end of his life. So again, this is a little bit of an enigma. But I think the willingness to question whether he was doing the right thing and try and pursue that course, even when it was hard, is probably his biggest moral strength.
What about third aspect? This would have been, of course, from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Renaissance, civic republicanism or civic virtue that you mentioned. Of course, just to clarify, it's small r. Where do you think he excelled or really exemplified for Americans in a young nation the importance of civic virtue?
So I would say two things. The first is he had a commitment to sacrifice as an important part of citizenship, especially if you were privileged, if you were an elite American, if you had means, if your day-to-day existence did not require you laboring with your own two hands. You owed your community and you owed your nation service. Now, sometimes that would be military, sometimes that would be public service, sometimes that would be political service. And it was supposed to be a sacrifice. It was not supposed to be a way to enrich yourself. It wasn't always going to be fun. It meant that you were often away from home and you would maybe take a financial hit. But he believed in that and lived that because he was gone from home so much when he really preferred not to be. The part of that I think is often overlooked was his commitment to civil authority as part of his service. He, as a military commander, always subordinated himself to civil authority, and that was really the core of the American Republic in his idea. You couldn't have military authority on top or it wasn't a republic anymore. It was a military dictatorship. And that concept of military service being subordinate to civilian authority is one that sometimes is hard for us to wrap our minds around today because we're used to sort of a professional military establishment and all of that, but it was really essential to Washington.
In addition to the intellectual virtues, moral character virtues, and the civic virtues, civic republicanism that the founders were aware of, there's another category. It's, today we don't talk about it much, but it would have developed in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, it's called theological virtue, but you could call it spiritual virtue, or if you're a very modern person, you might call it sort of the existential virtues. What are those virtues that we need, for example, to have hope? Mm-hmm. We're all in this together. There's something that unites all of us. George Washington's religion is a topic of some controversy. It's his words and actions on various occasions can be interpreted differently. What would you say about his spiritual life, his virtues?
So I would say he believed in a concept of providence, of what we might think of as sort of a divine fate. I don't think that he was certainly not someone who was a supporter or an ardent supporter of what we would think of as organized religion today. He did go to church occasionally because that's what was sort of socially expected, but I think his sense of religion was much more internal, not unlike, I would say, some of the other framers that we think of, like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Now, they had nuance in those things, but they all believed that religion was generally not something that you should find in the walls necessarily of a church. It was a much more internal, much more private, much more existential experience. And Washington had a real conviction in the importance of this providence. There were times when he should have died. He should have been shot off countless horses. He had holes in his uniform where bullets whistled through his coat. He had horses shot out from underneath him, but he had this conviction that he was destined, sort of a destiny for higher cause that saw him through. He certainly had a sense of community, and they all did, because they understood, life was very communal back then. It was not as individualistic as it is today. So for example, not to wade into sort of political waters, but they encountered a lot of pandemics. And as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, Washington ordered smallpox inoculation for all of his soldiers. And inoculation was a much more gruesome process than a shot. You basically took a knife and sliced it through, sorry if anyone just ate, a pustule of an infected person, and then sliced that knife through the arm of a healthy person. And it gave you a more mild case, basically, of smallpox. But smallpox was so deadly that it was a military threat. He had to do it. And so he understood the communal nature of existence and survival, especially in war.
The last, because of all this physical description of disease, it reminds me that the last category of virtue that we could discuss before, and we want to open this up to you. So just one or two more questions, and then we hope you feel free to ask questions. But we've got to talk about physical virtue as well. He was somewhat of a vain man, I would say, and I always tell my classes, in fact, I stand, if you'll permit me to stand up. You're welcome to as well. But if you look at the portraits of George Washington, he's always standing there with his leg out because he's showing off those thigh muscles. He's a horseman, he's an equestrian, he's got the leg strength. The joke is that, of course, it's women who are showing off their legs today, but in the 18th century, it was the men showing off their legs. So it was really kind of a funny thing how vain he could be, but he did have a real sense of presence, didn't he?
He did, and this is often the butt of jokes, especially when we look at portraits, but it was actually really important, and it's just as important today, too. When someone walks in the room and they have real presence, we notice that. If a basketball player walks in the room and you're like, oh my gosh, that person's really tall. Or if someone, is a model and they're striking and beautiful. As a society, we value certain physical attributes. And the 18th century was no different. Horsemanship was an essential social skill, But it wasn't just social. It was the way that you made business connections. It was how you networked. It was how you made family connections. And if you were a commander-in-chief, you better know how to ride a horse because you have to be on one all the time. So even Thomas Jefferson, who was a phenomenal horseman, and he didn't really like to say that anyone was better at anything than him, said that Washington was the greatest horseman of the age. And that was a really important quality. So his physical attributes, his physical presence, lent a certain element to his leadership because he took up space. I mean, quite literally, we were talking about this beforehand, but in addition to his leg, right? When he posed, he did the arms because that was, there, and he also would have had a sword, which quite literally makes people step aside because you don't want to get hit by a sword, right? So you are literally claiming space, you are claiming a presence, and he cultivated that intentionally. He wore his military uniform to the Continental Congress when they ultimately appointed him as commander. That was no accident. He wanted to be appointed, and so he intentionally cultivated the era of a military leader in order to do so.
Oh, this is great. Well, let's open up the floor. You have questions? Yes, sir.
I apologize at the beginning that this is probably going to sound like an exceedingly trite question after such an excellent academic discussion here, but as a school child in the 1950s, February came and what we did is colored cherries, and there was a hatchet, and I remember the story that Washington got a hatchet, and to test the hatchet he went out and chopped down a cherry tree, and his father demanded to know what happened, and I cannot tell a lie, it was me. Is there any truth to that? Where did it come from?
No truth to that. So almost immediately, the cult of Washington began to develop. His story, his life was useful in the Reconstruction period, as I mentioned, but it was useful almost right away because it bolstered the concept of Republican virtue, it bolstered the American identity. I think,
Parson Weems.
Parson Weems, thank you. He just made stuff up. I mean, he quite literally made stuff up. He was the greatest propagandist. So no, there is no truth to that story. There's no truth to the story that he could throw. Has anyone heard the story that he could throw a silver dollar? It's like over a mile across the river. It's not physically possible. That didn't happen. But they're good stories. They get at something in the American experience about what we want Washington to be, and that is almost as useful as the story itself.
We have a question over here.
The question that I have was from a discussion I had not too long ago with a group of friends. And do keep in mind this took place in a bar.
Okay, good context.
But one of my friends said that when it was time to, what do we call Washington when he became president? And one of my friends said that he wanted to be called His Excellency because that way he wouldn't have to shake hands with people and he didn't like to be touched. Is that true? Talking about stories.
Okay, so this is an excellent question. The answer is actually a little bit more complicated. So you're right that Washington didn't particularly like to be touched. One of my favorite Washington stories was Gouverneur Morris, who was a close friend of Washington, and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton dared Gouverneur Morris to go up and basically slap Washington on the back, saying hey buddy, old pal. And he did, and Washington turned and looked at him and gave him the icy glare. So he did not like to be touched. Why he preferred a simple title like His Excellency, which doesn't sound simple to us, but at the time, governors, military commanders, they were all referred to as His Excellency, so it was fairly common in terms of status. He felt that anything more ostentatious would be too monarchical. Whereas John Adams, who had just spent many, many years in Europe and knew the customs of European courts, was worried that something like His Excellency or even Mr. President would be laughable if a French minister came to the US. So there was actually a huge squabble about it in Congress, and a lot of people thought Madison approved of Mr. President, a more simplistic Republican term, and a lot of people thought he was speaking for Washington, and so they voted for that option. It's unclear. Washington certainly approved of Mr. President. It's unclear whether or not he and Madison had actually been in cahoots on the subject. But Washington did prefer what we would think of as a more simple title to I think His Highness and Elected Protector of Our Liberties was what Adams preferred.
It was a little more pompous.
Yeah, it doesn't really roll off the tongue.
Yes, Don? Don's one of our professors of history here, presidential history.
Oh,
Grand Valley.
fantastic.
Do we have a presidential historian in our midst?
Hi. I wanted to ask you, because I think about all the early presidents who had served in the cabinet before, and we haven't really had that in a very long time. Mm-hmm. Do you think serving as a cabinet secretary is good preparation for a man or woman to be president someday?
It's a great question. I do think it's really, well, I should start by saying there's no role that really prepares you for it, right? Like there's nothing like it in the world. And if choices get to I think President Obama used to say, like, there are no easy decisions because easy decisions get taken care of before they get to the desk of the president. That's only for the really hard choices. I think that as far as positions go, certainly things like the Secretary of State, it gets you pretty close, maybe the Secretary of Defense. I think the reason we don't see that anymore is because we've seen a professionalization of those careers. We expect people who have had a career in the military to serve as the Secretary of Defense. We expect people who've worked in the financial industry to serve as the Secretary of the Treasury. And those people, understandably, often don't want to go into politics. Or if they do, they don't necessarily have the background that gets them political support. So we have had cabinet members run. They just haven't necessarily had the institutional or sort of grassroots backing.
Do we have a student in the House who could ask a question? I always like to call on students. There we go.
Excellent.
We have a student.
Given the founders' sustained engagement with classical thought, when Washington is fashioning his self-image, do we see him trying to model himself after classical models, like taking a page out of Augustus's playbook?
So unlike some of the other framers, he didn't necessarily gravitate to one per se, but I think that's partly because he didn't have the sustained classical education that someone like Adams or Jefferson or Madison had. He certainly understood a lot of the ideology that was being discussed and had consumed some of the literature. He was very aware of the Cincinnatus parallels that people drew, and I think that idea was really appealing to him. He saw himself, I think, first and foremost as an innovative farmer, and indeed he was. He was very entrepreneurial. He was constantly exchanging texts and seeds and clippings with people in England who were more ahead of the curve in terms of innovating with crop rotation and soil treatments. So he really thought of himself in that way first. And so I think if there was one that appealed to him, it was Cincinnatus, especially because of the returning of the power. But I don't necessarily think that he necessarily modeled himself after that in the way that some others did.
You got Fabius the Delayer because of the way he conducted his military strategy in the Revolutionary War.
True.
Where rather than agree to Cornwallis or Clinton in a pitched battle, he just kept retreating and retreating and let the enemy's lines become attenuated and picked his own time and place the way Fabius in ancient Rome did. There are a lot of
parallels.
Americans were always searching for that classical figure.
Always.
You obviously are a first-rate scholar on Washington. I'm interested in what you think is the best biography. Did Douglas Southwell Freeman really write it? Or what do you think is the best biography of him?
Well, that's not really a fair question. That's like asking a parent to choose their favorite child. I have favorites of different points in his life. So I think that Gentleman Warrior by Stephen Brumwell is my favorite treatment of the war. There's a book by Ed Larson called The Return of Washington on that sort of middle period between the war and the presidency that talks about his political savvy that I love. I do think, one volume biographies are nearly impossible because unless they're going to be 1 trillion pages, they're not going to cover everything. They're going to have to make choices. So I do think as 1 volume books go, I think Chernow's is probably the best and most comprehensive. But when I'm trying to understand someone's life, I prefer the more segmented approach because I feel like I get more nuance and analysis about that period of time. I hope that helps.
One of my favorite, Hillary, for just one volume, James Thomas Flexner's Indispensable Man is still...
That's a great one.
Is a book that I enjoy dipping into still. It's a kind of a, well, it's a classic that endures, even though a lot of the research has superseded it at this point. It's a good read. Another question.
It's always fun to discuss the what ifs of history. You're talking about Washington's transition from power. He almost died in office, I believe his first,
Many
second term.
times.
If he had, how different would the transition look today? Because when Harrison passed, there was some question about should Tyler become the president or not. There was nothing in the Constitution about it. How would that have changed if he had died in office?
It's a great question. Counterfactuals are always tricky. So I think that, Washington was really sick a couple of times in his first term. One in particular, in his first year in office, he had a terrible abscess on his leg that had to be cut out without the benefit of modern surgery. And there was a real question about whether or not he was going to make it, and John Adams was terrified because, in theory, his job was to be the backup. I think that if he had died in that first year, I honestly don't know what would have happened. I don't know. I generally don't like to be this sort of dramatic, but I don't know that the Republic actually would have made it as it did. Because Washington was really he was the only person that could serve as the first president because he was the only person with the national stature to hold everybody together for a bit until started to get some of these practices and norms and customs in place. Adams was really well respected in New England and had a lot of respect from his service abroad, but Southerners didn't know him, and vice versa with Thomas Jefferson. If Washington had died maybe in 1796, that might have gone a little differently. If maybe then I think Adams would have probably assumed office. But that's one to ponder. That's a good question.
Zoom questions. Way to go. We don't want to neglect our Zoom audience.
One of them says, Lindsay, I'm hoping you are writing book number 2. If so, would you mind sharing a little bit about what that would be about?
I am. So after this one, I'm not going chronologically, but I couldn't help it. So I am writing about John Adams' presidency. I became convinced as I was writing about this process, I've just spent the last almost hour talking about the importance of firsts and precedents. But if they aren't continued, if they aren't fostered, and if they aren't protected, then it becomes an interesting historical anecdote or a footnote that we read about in a book. So I think that number 2 is almost as important as number 1 because it preserved the cabinet, the presidency, the transitions, the peaceful process. And so I am trying to sort of explain how that happened, and why it's really, really important. I think John Adams gets a little bit of a short shrift when it comes to his presidency, partly because Thomas Jefferson mostly had the last word on that subject. And so I'm attempting to tell that story and why it's so important to the American experience. It's also a great deal of fun because while I have loved writing about George Washington, Martha burned their correspondence at his request. And I think that's where all the juicy stuff would have been, all of the sarcasm and the snark and the grudges. Abigail asked John to burn their correspondence, and he was disobedient. And as a historian, I am so grateful because those letters are just gold, and it is so fun to dig into their personalities. So I'm having a great time writing it. It will be out in 2024.
I think we have another question from Zoom.
The next one says, President Washington and President Ford were men of impressive physical stature and singular moral character. Do you think these are required elements of being presidential in the American Republic?
Well, I would like to think that the moral part would be required. I don't think history has borne that out. And history has demonstrated that the physicality is not necessary per se. FDR, of course, was in a wheelchair, although he very rarely presented himself publicly in that way. So there's no doubt that we tend to conflate physical strength with the strength to endure the emotional and mental and intellectual challenges of office. We think that if someone is, big and strong, then they can be big and strong in service of the nation. So ideally that would not be necessarily how we think about leadership, but it's obviously a very important subconscious part of how we evaluate people?
That's a great question. If I could
It
just
is,
add.
please.
I do think that we need to refocus on the ethical dimensions of leadership in the fiercest way. We need to have really honest conversations about the character of our presidents. And they're tough, but they need to be had. And we need to call our presidents on it when they're not being ethical.
I agree because, one of the things that history shows us is presidents can run on economic issues and end up dealing with primarily foreign policy or vice versa. You cannot predict what is going to be the big issue in a presidency. What you can predict is if you are electing someone that you think has good judgment and you think will try and do the right thing. And that's about all you can be sure of.
One of the things, Lindsay, that we do over at the Ford Foundation is that we never would argue that President Ford was a great president. Usually great presidents have had terrible wars, and the country has come through. So we think of Washington establishing the republic, Lincoln maintaining it, and then FDR saving it from existential threats. But what we argue at the Ford is that President Ford was an outstanding, an excellent character right there at the top. And we're proud of that fact that he's right here from West Michigan, and he provides a leadership model for every young person, man or woman, who grows up and studies his life. You'll see what the fortitude looks like to do the tough thing, make the tough decisions. And we're proud of that. And I think it's a great model for any leaders, but especially for our presidents.
I would add his wife did the same.
Oh, thank you for saying. We love Mrs. Ford because she and he, if you don't mind my talking about
Please.
Ford for just a minute, it's President's Day. Mrs. Ford and President Ford form a polarity. He was, of course, temperamentally conservative, prudent. She was feisty. She was fiery. She had guts. She's the one who's going to dance, literally dance on the cabinet table.
If you haven't seen that picture, I highly recommend looking it up. It's fantastic.
I mean, she's the one. Let's look at how revolutionary she was. I mean, we ought to have a First Ladies' Day with the President's Day. She was so feisty that when she got the cancer diagnosis, she insisted that the doctor speak to her. It wasn't that long ago, in the 1970s. Doctors were still talking to the woman's husband about the diagnosis. And Mrs. Ford insisted on hearing the truth herself. That was a revolution in our medical care. We forget what my generation's mothers, your grandmothers, went through. So you've got that. You've got a woman who is willing to talk about addiction. There were a lot of pills, a lot of alcohol available to that generation. She was frank with them. It's a remarkable interview that she gave with Morley Safer on 60 Minutes, also with Newsweek magazine, where she discusses with candor her struggle with being a lonely housewife. Her husband was out on the road 200 nights a year. She was raising 4 kids by herself. Can you imagine how hard that was? But she faced her demons, and she shared them with us, and it's really remarkable.
She's
So
remarkable.
they're in this polarity, and you cannot really talk about President Ford without also talking about Mrs. Ford. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. She's fantastic. She's, I think, a understudied character and one that deserves more attention, so I'm glad you gave that description.
We have one more from Zoom. We had somebody ask why you think that we don't have a legislature or judiciary day. Senators and justices were popular and important in setting precedents. Why prioritize President's Day?
Well, it's much easier to study one person than it is to study, 100 or 500 and something, depending on where we are in history. There tends to be a lot more turnover in Congress. There tends to be a lot bigger range of the types of personalities we're talking about, or even necessarily the caliber of people we're talking about. There was a great period of history where people would come and serve one term and are practically forgotten. I mean, you can't even find a Wikipedia page for them. You have to go into the local county records to figure out who these people are. So I think it's easier to gloss over those things. Congress has always been a lot more contentious. It's always been a lot more partisan because of the nature of representation and the way that it captures the different political ideas. There's a great book by Joanne Freeman called Field of Blood that looks at the violence up until the Civil War in Congress. there were constant battles, knife fights, duels, canings, you name it, they happened all the time. So that's really interesting, but not necessarily something we want to celebrate. And for a long time, the court was often in the background. It has also always been a political institution. Anyone who says otherwise is not reading their history books. But it was sort of it was a much more subtle, a much more quiet institution, much less publicized. And while there have been some extraordinary justices who really do deserve a lot of attention and celebration, I think it's easier to see them as, sort of just the black robe as opposed to people, which presidents are a little bit easier to see as our representatives. They represent all Americans.
Okay, well, I think we're going to start wrapping up here. I would like to ask one last question, or give you the opportunity to tell about something that's very innovative, actually. You have an app. You have an app, and I think we ought to hear about that.
So it's not actually my app. I'm helping. So there's this app called Threadable, which is basically like an online book club of sorts. So if you've ever looked at a historical document and been like, I don't really understand what they mean by that word, or if you've ever read a book and you've been like, gosh, I wish I could talk to someone who's also reading this book, but maybe none of your friends or family members are reading it. The idea behind this app is to bring together people, I affectionately refer to them as history nerds or book nerds, who want to discuss these things in more detail. They're in testing phase right now, trying to figure out if it's useful, if there would be good innovative uses for it in the classroom or publicly. So they've tapped a bunch of scholars, myself included, to test it out. And so I'm running test circles on the Farewell Address and on the Alien and Sedition Acts. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Kevin Cruz or Jamel Bowie. There are some other people who have provided commentary on my documents. I provide sort of background context. I ask questions. I provide comments, occasionally insert snarky emojis, because why not? History should be fun. So it's something that I am testing out, and I'm hopeful that if it continues to develop, it would be a way that I could allow readers, if they want to dig deeper into the sources that I'm exploring or kind of follow along as I do some of the reading with me, to ask questions and share their thoughts. So if anyone is interested, please do let me know. I'd be happy to provide the invite codes for those, and you can find, unfortunately the app is only available to iOS users right now, much to my chagrin because I'm a Samsung user, but it is only available to that right now. But if you're interested, I'd love to have you join the circles and see you there.
Well, thank you so much for a
Thank
really
you.
engaging and enlivening evening. I enjoyed and learned so much listening to you tonight. I also want to again thank our partners, the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, who joined with the Presidential Foundation to host this evening. We really hope you'll be able to come back to Grand Rapids.
Love to.
You'll always find a very appreciative audience. Let's give Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky